Charles, thank you for coming today. It's a great honour to have you part of Property Rocks the Cotswolds, and I'm sure you'll give us a really inspiring talk. Charles, thank you very much.
Well, as you can imagine, this is a really interesting place. You look so wonderful, I have to say. You're gleaming. Anyway, I'm going to take you on a sort of visual story, starting in a sense from the big, and obviously what it's all about is focusing ultimately on the Cotswolds. And as we all know, it's about the same image, getting rid of that image as the only thing that is the Cotswolds. Obviously, the cheese company is good, I'm sure, but there's clearly more than cheese, and that's lovely. And of course, we know what Cheltenham looks like, and it has a graciousness and a grandeur which we can't neglect. But one of the problems, as we well know, is cost. And we had a conversation, Michelle and I, with the people from Cheltenham Council about retirement homes. And that is really a problem, because if there are going to be more and more retirement homes as there are, where will the young come? Where will they live? What is going to happen? Because this is, of course, a price issue. And that guy mentioned some interesting proposals which were quite radical, that one might have to actually not ban exactly, but disencourage retirement homes. So anyway, the problem about beautiful places is, of course, that is the tendency for things to happen. And we all know that within that there's tradition. We know that the Gloucester Docks, where we are now, is probably one of the best spots, the best collections of old buildings in Europe. There's no doubt that that is the case, and I'm not sure that that really is projected enough. It's pretty unique. I think it's better than the Albert Docks in Liverpool. I'm not being patriotic or parochial or whatever the word is, but it just simply is a fact, and I'm not sure that is recognised. Now, one of the big issues in all of that, when places are so attractive, if you just look at this slide here, which happens to be Zurich, they're regenerating the area, and Amazon and all the sort of new tech companies are coming in, and the Renaissance Hotel is there. Then the one building that was left, an artist owned it, and he put in the same writing, resistance. And so you can see Renaissance resistance, and that actually is part of, I'm not saying it's a problem, it is a problem, of course, but this question of dealing with aspects of price, gentrification and all of that, making the best of that is really a challenge. And we know, is it Barton Road, Barton Street? I keep on forgetting if it's road or street. Is an example of a place which obviously many people find a bit iffy, but it's precisely the place, if you look at cities around the world, where much of the newer energy comes from. And I'm aware that when we're talking about innovation, of course, there are more established companies, but there's also that whole startup culture. Now, a few years ago, I worked for an organisation in Gloucestershire which will not be named, and I looked at their documents and highlighted a series of words which I said, you must forbid. And one of the words was strategy. I just looked at this document, and the amount of times the word strategy appeared, and then I was just thinking, can I actually understand that? Then I said, there are another 6 words that I want you to forbid, which is development, policy, framework, all of these words. And then I did the same thing, and that's how many words that appeared. Now, if you extract those words and then try to read the meaning, it's tautological. It's just saying the strategy of the strategy of the strategy. And that's why I think the attempt of Property Rocks to try and find a new way of communicating is absolutely key. That way of communicating cannot actually grasp the opportunities that any place has. And I know I'm being a bit wicked, but I haven't said which the organisation was, but it was a very serious organisation here. So as we all know, there is another Cotswolds. There's lots of Cotswolds, there's lots of Cheltenhams, there's lots of Londons, there's lots of Bristols and so on. And as I was quickly driving past, this is just one of the many companies, I could have chosen others, there's obviously new tech companies. And in that review I did at the time, where I just was a bit horrible about the words, we really discovered interesting clusters. One of the clusters in the Cotswolds is really a green focus. There's a strong, when you really take a helicopter view, strong potential green focus within the Cotswolds. Another piece of work I did, and I stole this from the internet, was around the cultural sector, just looking at their links. Where do they connect to? And just like the bigger companies here are connecting globally, there are lots of small entities that are tiny, whose networks and work, which you won't see often, which is invisible, is actually global too. And I think there has been, as you well know, the cathedral's attempts to do things differently are really, in principle, quite inspiring, as we well know. And not to say Gloucester Service Station, which is a dream. I mean, that again is one of these things that would fit in part of a bigger story that the Cotswolds is about. And it goes very much with the flow of many of the global movements, which is all about ultimately the, I suppose, authenticity, difficult word to use, but you know what I mean, and that whole issue about the local. But one of the problems, it's not a problem, but it's just a question of focus, is so much of the Cotswolds talk is that heart, that image I showed of Vibrary at the very beginning. Whereas in fact, if you just go to the edge, and because I live quite near Stroud, here's another one of these green companies. Ecotricity is probably the largest green energy provider in the UK. And there, that place has been an alternative centre for innovation, probably for 120 years. If you track its history, all sorts of alternative things that are obviously sometimes mad, but sometimes fine. But, you know, where does innovation come from? Experiment that often doesn't work, and we obviously know that Stroud is alternative, this guy getting massage in a public space, this guy, Dennis, you know, I don't know if you know Dennis, anyone who's in Stroud knows Dennis. He's a sort of version of an old hippie, but nevertheless, he's part of this tapestry that when you're talking about a creative ecosystem, you have to include. And here, this happens to be my daughter, but doesn't matter, is Gifford Circus, which is part, again, of that tapestry. So all of that is to do with different places, spaces, and how we pull things together. And just a final thing on the Cotswolds, perhaps, Pangolin, which again is in the Stroud Valley, once did a bit of an analysis of the actual craft skills that still exist in that valley. And given issues about advanced manufacturing and all of these things, and the decline in some of these skills, Pangolin is the biggest producer of sculptures for people, and you know Damien Hirst's studio is just next door to that. So there is also that other side, which I just feel should be part of the story rather than the nice, beautiful, in quotes, places. It's also the grotty that I think we have to take into account. I was about to say this is grotty, it's not really grotty, it's quite something. So let's just take a closer look now and go a bit wider, if you don't mind, and if I can take you on a sort of visual story of some other things. Now there's a saying, this is a guy called Patrick Geddes, who was someone 100 years ago, who was a biologist and an urban planner. And he said this phrase, "A city is more than a place in space, it's a drama in time." And I really like that, because what we're trying to discuss is really things like energy, vitality, vibrancy, and so on. And that is rather like a drama. But the key issue, as we all know, and this is a global phenomenon, is what I call the vortex effect. And the vortex effect is obviously the way bigger places with critical mass suck in energy from elsewhere. So the Cotswolds does all the R&D, provides the education, and then the person expresses themselves somewhere else. And that point about the vortex effect is really dramatic, because you want your younger people to go, of course, because you want them to be experienced in some way, but you also want them to come back. And the question is, what are the assets that the smaller place has when everybody is ultimately sucked into the metropolis? And if you take the top 25 cities around the world, or the top 6 in Europe, you can see how much talent they're grabbing from elsewhere, and that's of course happening at an international scale. Even though the places that we come to could look like this. Even though those metropolises are often places that are unbelievably dysfunctional, they still have this unbelievable power. But the issue really, and which is why I talked about cheapness in Stroud, is that the big battle is cheapness. Cheapness, in fact, is one of the biggest assets if you're trying to keep the innovation system alive. And if you've got that, in some sense, you can increase your footprint. Now, of course, we know that the pull to London, particularly the age groups that are going to London, which of course tends to be the 23 to 37-year-olds or whatever, and then quite a lot of them come back. But how can you keep that cohort which has that initial great energy and finds as much as they find in London also in this area, the Cotswolds here, including obviously the areas that I'm calling for the moment grotty, but I don't mean it that they are grotty, I'm just saying they're a bit dilapidated. But the attraction of the core places is absolutely astounding when you do this. And one of the measures that really the Cotswolds should do is really try to measure how many people are coming in and how many people are going out. And the same applies, that was London, this is Paris, this is the cafe where Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir always used to hang out. So Paris, even though some people like to slag it off and say, oh, it's lost its energy, has got a really renewed vitality. And one of the problems for a Paris, though, is it's incredibly bureaucratic, relatively speaking, to the British context, where it's relatively shorter to set up businesses, it's relatively shorter and easier to do things, which is more complex in a Paris. So simplicity of things like planning, simplicity of getting things done is another one of those assets. So cheapness, simplicity, not too much bureaucratic spaghetti and so on. New York, of course, we know, is one of these other cities, and the major move there recently was, of course, the High Line, which is probably too popular. The fact that they, in Times Square, made, they just had an experiment of putting seats there, and then people never wanted to get off the seats, so they had to pedestrianise part of Times Square and so on. And of course, the big trendy place for the moment, of course, is Berlin. And one of the reasons, although now prices are going up, is because there was always a double of everything in Berlin. There was two of everything, two of this, two of that, two prisons, two big electricity works that could be turned into incubation centres and so on. And so that, just gave people of all sorts opportunities to be there. And then the final city that I'll just highlight is Amsterdam. And Amsterdam, I was recently chairing the European Capital of Innovation, and they won the award partly because of the innovative way the city was managed, the risks they were willing to take, and even the city said to one big property development company, whatever you do, make it feel like this. Yeah? Make it feel like this. Now, why did they say a caravan park? Because in a caravan park, you have to connect, you have to somehow communicate. They didn't actually build it like that ultimately. But it's just interesting that they were willing to go to the edge to say something. And as we all know, one of the big things is about forms of incubation where people can have new forms of offices and so on, and how you can really support the creative economy. Now, in Britain, it's much more difficult than some European countries. This happens to be Rotterdam, and where they have creative vouchers, which sort of do all the things like interesting loan systems and so on. So there's a whole set of infrastructures, which are soft infrastructures, that a city needs to, or a region needs to put in place to really encourage a sort of deeper level of a sort of real interesting ecosystem. And this is just, again, one of these typical buildings where 4 offices are here. It's not the typical office, you know all about that. But it's just creating spaces where people can interact in different ways. And there are hundreds of these, and so I don't need to tell you, doesn't really matter where it is. I do know where it is. It's in fact in Taipei, but it could be anywhere else. This happens to be in Amsterdam. Now, I think the main point to note is the bigger issue around the economy, which we all know, and I won't bang on about that, but from a position 20, 30 years ago where we might have had one idea, one producer, one distributor going to households in various forms, we've reached a completely different situation where this is supposed to be moving automatically. It isn't. To a situation where you have far smaller entities collaborating in interesting little ways, which is why obviously the notion of networking has become utterly different than before. So what you can see here is the way supply chains work, the way distribution networks work and so on is very different. So I just want you to bear in mind the first image, which is quite static, and this second image, which was supposed to be moving around and doing things, but it isn't, but don't worry. Oh, it is. Oh, yeah, I'm looking at this. I'm sort of pretending to look at you, but I'm looking at this. You know, I'm sort of doing this sort of, yeah, he's all relaxed, he knows what he's saying and all of that. Complete bollocks. Anyway, so it did move. But anyway, you get the idea of what I'm saying. So just visually, that is a different story. Now, one of the things I think is really interesting, and it took me, this sounds simple, but it took me a long time to work out, thinking of smaller places, and the Cotswolds is obviously a smaller place, and there's a funny thing, and this is why what Rock the Cotswolds is so important, is if you are, this place, this region, is small enough to make it happen, and big enough to be taken seriously, because we know the name Cotswolds, so at least we recognise it. It exists in the world. If people are not parochial here, not parochial, the problem about a smaller place is obviously the danger of being parochial, then the chances are so much bigger because there's less complexity. Now, in the Cotswolds case, there's a specific difficulty, which does mean that Gloucester needs to learn to love Cheltenham and vice versa. Stroud needs to feel relaxed about whoever, Cirencester, etc., etc. And that, I think, is going to be really one of the interesting problems. I'm not going to say challenges. I don't want to be politically correct. You're not allowed to say problems anymore nowadays. Anyway, so that, I think, is the big opportunity, which is getting the best of the smaller place, that intimacy with the best of the bigger place, which is, in a sense, this wider world. Oh, sorry, this is just going differently than I'm thinking. Yeah. Of this wider world. And that interesting combination of local, global is really what I think is part of the story that you're talking about. So now let's just go a bit into this creativity, culture, the city bit, because I think what you're really doing here is trying to create a cultural shift, which obviously is ultimately about perception. You're using as one of your resources creativity as that form of energy, and I've just put the city there, but I could have said the Cotswolds, but you know what I'm saying, a place, a space. Now, creative city making in general, and I wrote a book about this, in one sentence, is an ethos that is empowering, and it's about creating the conditions where people can think, plan and act with imagination, where that is legitimised. And in the context of the area we're in, we're back to that point I'm saying, is these dots need to be connected, not 24/7, but at least for most of the time, because otherwise I don't think the potential will be fulfilled. Now, the general argument that I'm making, and I hope it's somehow relevant to Property Rocks, is that culture determines a place. The culture of Gloucester is different from Cheltenham and Stroud and all of that. And of course, it's creativity that shapes the life in some sort of sense. It's the lifeblood of places. And the challenge we have is always different. It depends on time. Initially, in the 19th century, it was clearly public health issues that were important. That meant that issues like infrastructure, the hardware of the city was the key thing. But as we know, much of the hardware that we built is basically ugly. This is a graffiti from Turin, where someone says, I've got to fight against ugliness all my life, or whatever. Now, the focus of creativity will change, and that's what's interesting for me, because clearly I came back from Venice on Monday. It wasn't like that, thank God, but it was about to flip over, but this is not Photoshop. And so these are interesting creative challenges, which is why I focused on that overview I once made and saw so many green innovations coming out of this district. The other one is, of course, how we get on together with difference. And then, of course, how we manage and organise and run the democracy so it's a bit more fluid, open, allows better forms of partnering together, partnering as a normal part of life rather than the exceptional thing that happens occasionally. Here's another sentence that took me so long to work out. Sounds so easy. Creativity is a renewable resource and heritage non-renewable. It's not quite like that because you can reinterpret heritage like this building. But the point I'm really saying is quite often the thing that we think is the classic today, the thing that was so great, was yesterday's innovation. If you think of that Eiffel Tower there, of course there are engineering things that we still use today, and I put it next to a hydroponic building which is part of the Louvre to show that there are two forms of innovation in the same image. But what I'm just trying to say is these are not necessarily worlds apart, and I think this is a Cotswolds thing, that heritage and creativity can form great partnerships. But that really requires planning systems and others to be a bit more relaxed and say, hey, can't we ram something innovative into something old? Because the old might need a bit of refreshing in some way. I'm not saying do it every minute, every day. But basically my point is these things don't work necessarily in conflict. And you can see that this happens to be the Sagrada Familia from inside. And what I suppose I'm really saying is there's always been creativity. Its focus has changed over time, and you're always trying to find out what is the thing that really matters. Now, this is a big issue, and you'll know much more about this than me. Clearly, to get the perceptual shift externally, I think you can do that. I'm amazed that you got all these free ads. Christ, amazing. You know, I don't know how you did it, but anyway, you did it. But the issue is the internal self-perception is often much, much more difficult. And getting that cultural shift internally to see the Cotswolds as a place of innovation as well as the opposite, the past and so on, is not easy. And because, as we well know, culture is the DNA of a place. Sometimes it's good. We always say culture is so great, but also sometimes it's quite negative. It holds one back. It doesn't allow one to fulfill potential and so on. In my view, as you can imagine, I think this cultural stuff, this creative stuff is like a currency. And I think, because we've got this vortex effect I've mentioned earlier, it is 1 minute before midnight in a certain way. And what I'm really saying, it's urgent. But the most important thing to start with, although I always used to talk so much about creativity, is we've got to develop here, I think, and I don't know, you're a better judge of this, a culture of curiosity, where people are curious. I think the thing that cathedral events with the public art and so on is an example of being curious, doing something. But there are hundreds of other examples that could take place. So for me, if we've got a place, the Cotswolds, which is a place that is generally curious, if it's curious, it's likely to be imaginative and have some ideas. If it's got some ideas, some of these may be creative. Lots of them will be useless, of course. Of course they're useless, some of them, but one or two will stick. They might become an invention, which then becomes an innovation, and then you've got a sort of cycle that, sorry, I'm just, don't know what's happening there, but I'm sure it's happening. What I'm really just saying is this is a cycle that goes round, and then once you've got that innovation again, you then generate curiosity in a sort of positive sense. So all of that is, I think, important, but for many people it seems vague. And they say, well, what's the evidence? What are you talking about, this stuff? Talking about creativity as a resource. What the hell do you mean? And I therefore think that one of the key challenges which you're addressing is making these invisible assets visible in some sort of way, which I think is one of the things you're doing. So, for example, when you rejig this prison here, I'm hoping, and I'm sure you will, be doing some extra things that are interested and unexpected that show that in this case Gloucester understands this thing about the past and the present and so on. Now, the central question, or one of the big questions, is, of course, the dramatic changes that we all know about, and I'm not going to really talk about. But there has been, and I can assure you that practically every interesting, for me, city around the world has been going through a process a bit like you, which is about rethinking. And, you know, quite often it's quite difficult when we've got these documents that say strategy 50 times and all these other words that we should forbid. It's very difficult to see the clarity of the picture that one's trying to paint of the future. And most big cities, small cities, towns are asking themselves, how can we refit things together in a way? And the first thing that really happened 30 years ago, and I'm looking at it sort of more from a global perspective, was really saying, shifting to urban design thinking and really seeing that there's a bigger issue here and a focus on aesthetics rather than the purely functional. Obviously the things have to work. And so, for example, here, Malaga, this is a different type of way of addressing public space. This is the airport of Adelaide, entrance stroke exit. You know, it looks different from Heathrow or Birmingham or Bristol Airport. As an example. So you can see that shift happening all over the place. The next phase that happened, which again started roughly simultaneously, is to project the place as rich in culture, as having depth and having past culture but also contemporary culture. And it's always these things having to work together. And you know about that story, so I don't need to reiterate that. But that linked to all sorts of things, obviously animation and things like that, but also rethinking institutions. This happens to be an old Was Grotti library in Rio de Janeiro that just with a few fine touches looks really and feels inside quite inspirational as a place of participation and much more. On the basis of those two things, you've got an infrastructure that's basically quite attractive, a cultured place, there's some vibrancy there. That has been the thing, because you're talking about attracting talent, knowledge and all of that, which is often the platform within which the knowledge workers or the highly skilled people you want in particular are attracted to cities. And so that was very much the third phase. And this happens to be Denver, but it makes the point that this needs to be webbed into the city or the town, not sort of some isolated island in the middle of nowhere. And that are the first three things. And then overlaid on that, we have the whole thing about the startup culture. And I've already mentioned enough about that many of the things that are required there are really to do with soft infrastructures. They include, obviously, spaces and places and so on. And as you can imagine, this is in Helsinki, which, by the way, I must tell you this, talking about bloody branding, they have an event, the biggest startup event in Europe, called Slush, and it's in November. And what's the date? It's this weekend. Yeah? And it says their thing was, "Welcome to the dark, embrace the cold." Now you need courage to say that, yeah. And that is a confidence that they've built up because I believe they have some of these other things. So what we're really talking about is a sort of culture of creativity, if I can call it that, or being, when I say a culture of creativity, I don't mean, hey, let's all be crazy, I don't mean that, but just an openness to look at things fresh, to be willing to accept those things. And it could apply to anything. One of my obsessions is the second word here, obviously rethinking things, but a creative bureaucracy. One of the big blockages, and I'm making no comments about any Cotswold bureaucracy, but in general, this is the big issue. We need to rethink, the world's changing, so we also need to rethink how all of that operates. And one part of that is, thinking together, joined up thinking, as we well know. Another is understanding that these change processes are quite complex, fragile if you like, that they can fall apart. And there's a new world emerging, leaving aside Trump, we'll forget that for the moment. And one of those is the whole thing about digitization. Now, we know the pluses and minuses of that, but I think it's more than just smart city thinking, making a few objects in the city, self-regulating and so on. Because rarely is there something that happens that has such a gravitational pull that sucks everything into its orbit. And many people, perhaps the young, I don't know, think this is all very invigorating, but others are really pretty frightened of these processes and these dramas that we're just going through. Google is obviously one element of it. It also sucks things in, as you well know. This is from the Sydney Biennale. But when the biggest hotel chain in the world, Airbnb, owns no hotel rooms, when the biggest taxi company in the world, Uber, owns no taxis, when the biggest retailer in the world, Alibaba in China, has no inventory, and when the biggest media provider in the world, Facebook, produces none of its own media, the system has changed. And so you can't hide from these processes of big data, which enables all this to happen. And so what I think we're into a situation where the effects and implications are as dramatic as the Industrial Revolution. And clearly the mobile phone is the key element, or not element, what do you call it, the key thing that enables this to happen. And what the main point about it is that when you've got the anytime, anywhere, any place phenomenon, this can be an advantage for the Cotswolds. Because I, in theory, run a company. My company's so small, it's me and a dog sort of thing. I mean, I used to have a company which was bigger, but, I don't want to have to be answering the mobile phone all the time. But the point is, they often think Bourne's Green, where I live, could be London. They've got no bloody idea. I'm in the middle of nowhere. And as we all know, we can all operate from the middle of nowhere. And this is really the massive opportunity for the Cotswolds. Because you can be here and there simultaneously. You can pretend, it's not about pretense, but you can be partly in London. Do we need London all the time? We only need it partly. We can be partly in Birmingham, Bristol, wherever else, partly in Amsterdam. And the key thing, though, within this, flipping more to the negative, is all of this is happening at speed, and this young girl from Seoul, I don't know what she's going to be like in 10 years' time, but what are these old guys thinking? And so I'm really thinking about how do we get also this older cohort to find all of these things or see the positive within these movements. So what we've got is a culture of the digital, or the digitalist culture, whatever you want to call it. It's like, look, I'm saying the obvious, you know all this. It's a sort of electricity that's flowing through the system. And I don't want to use the word paradigm shift too often, but this is a paradigm shift, and it means we need to see the world in a different way. And that's why this point, your emphasis, in every sphere, all those things you showed, innovation, Property Rocks, all of the different themes you had, are so important. Because we're in the midst of designing the world and all its systems, and systems, legal, etc., property issues, how that works, economy, social, cultural life. And the question is, what's the vision of where next, obviously, and it should be human-centred. But what we then got is this world as a smaller place. But I think any place can be the centre of the universe. And I think the thing that you can fight with is quality of life. Quality of life is one of the key issues, because the bigger places are becoming dysfunctional. That is your thing. But having a quality of life that feels that you can be involved in this evolving quality of life, which is why I'm talking about cheapness. So just two more points I want to make, which is, the first is, you could simplify the world and say, what's the city 1.0, 2.0, 3.0? I'm simplifying. Okay, this is your historic city. We're here, okay? Every city is different. I've already said the first way of looking at the city was the hardware city, very much driven by the people who deal with hardware. They often create structures that feel soulless, motorway systems that feel completely impersonal. I would call that the urban engineering paradigm. This happens to be Dubai. And of course, I think that engineering is fantastic, by the way. Things have got to stand out. This is the Biennale. That isn't real. Doesn't matter, but it makes my point that things have to stand up. So I think engineering is wonderful, but we need the collective intelligences to come in. And the model of the 1.0 city is very much the factory as the thing. That's our model, hierarchical and all of that. And the culture is, what is it? You know, the culture is a certain repertoire. We need the building, which is the theatre and the opera house and the museum and all of that. And we need some red public art. I've done a survey, or I haven't really, but my observation tells me there's more red public art than green public art or blue public art. And in these buildings that are usually closed and not open and you can't see what's going on, there may be some interesting artistic activities happening. And that's where various people have said, hey guys, there's more to a city, isn't it? There's more to... When I say the city, I also mean smaller places, by the way. I'm just using shorthand. There's more to places than just that. There's the daily life expressed in a city. And so some people have said, hey, there's a different way of looking at this. Let's call it soft placemaking, where the people who are in charge of the soft disciplines have equal status than the hard. And unfortunately, it's still true that the people who deal with the hardware have higher status in local authorities than those dealing with the softer things. And this is really about understanding the senses in the city, how the city works as an emotional experience. Because when that emotional experience of place is satisfactory, that encourages precisely the exchanges which we require, which generate ultimately the innovations and all the vitality that we ultimately want. And this City 2.0 is, in a sense, also more participative. You open out different processes of thinking through planning. You more collectively ask, do we need Cheltenham to be a retirement home or do we need it to be something else? Transport becomes different. This is Chicago, where the mayor looked out on this and said, okay, let's create this. The cars are still there, it's more expensive, but the value of the totality is more, even though the project, of course, to get the cars underground cost more. Unfortunately, the knowledge thing is very much that 2.0 of putting the science park in the middle of nowhere. And this is when we get into things like smart city thinking and so on, which is fine. You know what that's about. And the culture 2.0 very much then looks at many of the things you do, the creative economy, issues like that, where you then do, and back to the older buildings and that older stock. This is the Nokia factory in Helsinki. And you're just reminded there of that wonderful saying by Jane Jacobs, the great urbanist, who said, new ideas need old buildings, which is why I keep on saying, let's have some new, let's have some old, let's blend them together in a different configuration. But this period is also the period where commerce realizes, hey, we need some substance, we need some meaning. How do I sell bags? How can Louis Vuitton sell bags? I need some artists to help me sell these bags. Let me get Yo-Yo Kusama in. And that season, 2014, was the best season of selling bags. Sorry, I'm not being too negative about it, but you know what I mean. Again, another relationship, culture, commerce. And what happens in the gentrification process, when you get that attractiveness that occurs, like here in Istanbul, the music quarter, the prices go up so much because everybody's interested in it, and that shop there, Baroque Music, is in fact about to become a Prada because Prada can pay 5 times as much. And I did a project in Mayfair about how do you save Cork Street and all of that, and there you need planning tools to say, these can't migrate into there because you'll destroy the thing that is in fact the value of what you want in the first place. And the final thing we might say is there's a City 3.0, which is, I think, the yearning that many people, and I think Rock the Cotswolds reflects this yearning that I'm talking about, to think there must be another way. There must be something that brings the best of 1.0, 2.0 and 3 together in a different way. And this is this arena era, or whatever you want to call it, which is slightly different. It's more fluid, flexible. This is Amsterdam, guys working in a container. You can see Container City in London as well, where the pop-up world is one of the main dominant features, which is, as I said, more flexible, where you talk about the creative zone, and the creative zone here is the Cotswold as a zone. You don't talk about a creative spot. You're really trying to create an environment that in general is like that, where technology is more interactive and seamless connectivity is the norm, where, you know, you can just go, move around, work in third spaces and feel connected and do your work. And all of that enables all the sharing. Some of the Cotswold areas sharing bikes might be a bit difficult. You might need electric bikes, I don't know, doesn't matter. But all I'm saying, all of the sharing economy ideas are enabled through that. And the urban design priorities in this is more about intimacy, compaction, density, finding places, as you can see here in Bologna, where people are working anywhere. And then with occasional innovations, this is a German innovation, of course, this office you can close and walk home, not quite like a dog. But anyway, you can move it around back to that point about flexibility. And openness is one of the key features of all of this, as we well know. And back to that point about the different silos within departments and within sectors and disciplines coming together in order to make 1 + 1 = 3. And if you looked at the culture of that place, it's the sort of culture where you're partly making it, less being purely a consumer, you're a participant in some way. And when you look at those cultural things, we're back to Chicago, this is different from the public art that's just read. This is Anish Kapoor, and you can see the way people interact with that. This is Jaime Plenza, where 3,000 Chicago people are coming and switching the pictures, and then occasionally you get squirted by a person, or perhaps you don't get squirted, but anyway. But it's obviously a different way of communicating, as you well know, where good ideas are shared in formats like we're experiencing now, I hope, and TEDx or TED is one of them. So in short, this 3.0 thing requires a different way of thinking about the physicality of the city, what it just looks and feels like. And it also has a different operating dynamic. And that's really, you know, it's the invisible stuff, it's governance, all of these things that are often not discussed enough. And so what we need is clearly an alignment between the best of all of these. So just finally, how would you measure that, if you wanted to measure that? It says the pulse of your city, it could say the pulse of the Cotswolds. And for us, we've done this, Bilbao asked us whether you could do that. We put it into 4 clusters. I'm not saying you should do that, but it might be just something useful to have in the back of your mind as Rock the Cotswolds. And the 4 clusters are, how do you identify and nurture talent and potential? And the 2 key issues we look at there and explore are the levels of openness in general, and how sophisticated the talent and learning landscape is. And by that I mean not only universities or classic education, it's all these other forms of learning. So broader learning opportunities within an open environment, i.e. being more open than closed. The second thing that we look at is what's the supporting, enabling structure like, the regulations and incentives framework, which is about the politics of the place and who's got power. Are they open? Are they strategic? Are they thinking ahead? Do they know what the issues are? Are they professional in the sense of walking the talk? And this requires a completely different level of trust between citizen, businesses, all the entities, and the political system. That brings me back to my point about creative bureaucracy, where we're more about principles, strategically principled in this region, and tactically flexible. We don't know how we're going to get there, but this is the direction of travel. The third thing is, how do you then harness and exploit those things, which is of course you're trying to do, which is about having lots of mechanisms that encourage entrepreneurship, all of the things that you've already discussed, I don't need to go into, and finding ways to communicate. Again, you are doing that already, but that communication is also about how is the rail network going to go from Cheltenham to London and all of these things that I'm not sure that British Rail is still going to be doing that, but nevertheless that's all important. So it's really about this incubation culture and things that I've already addressed. And finally, how is this lived and expressed? And this, again, is where the Cotswold has many assets. How distinctive is it? Of course, it's amazingly distinctive. How vital is it? Well, there's probably more vitality than we think. How is the place being made? Obviously, the place is already good, but how are the new developments? Is it up to a standard or down to a price? Is it really saying we want to be at this level? That's the only level we accept in the Cotswolds. And finally, obviously, we assess, and one assesses all the things like basic facilities, recreation, hospitals, and so on. So there we are, more or less, and that requires, of course, rethinking some rules. This is a Russian piece of art. I'm not surprised that this is a Russian piece of art. Rethinking the rules to some extent. And it requires us having new forms of collaboration, which I know that you are working on. So for me, because I've talked a lot about the soft, it took me another 30 years to work out, the soft is the hard. You know, building a building, I know is quite complex, but some of this other stuff I'm talking about, atmosphere, emotions, is quite difficult. So the implication in planning terms, finally, is we used to be in a situation where we planned for the known in a predict and provide way, and we're moving towards what I call elastic planning, which has this thing about we roughly know where we're going, but how we get there is not necessarily going to be in a straight line. So I think we have to switch the question to all the people out there and not be forced to say what's the value of this creativity and all this stuff that you're talking about, but what's the cost of not thinking about it. And so it's not really about money, it's often about mindset. So thank you very much.